We're filming at a landfill site today, one of the thousands of landfills that you'll find across the country, what are often referred to as sanitary landfills. But if you look around me, these landfills really don't look terribly sanitary. Actually, we're reaching a crisis condition in terms of solid waste management. To put it in another way, we're being overrun by our own garbage. Actually, about 70% of this garbage is biodegradable. Things such as papers, grass clippings, leaves, foodstuffs, all of this is decomposable material. That is, bacteria and fungi can decompose it, break it down into its basic nutrients, and recycle those nutrients back into the environment. The problem is that these materials are often covered with a heavy plastic, the plastic bags. They're buried down deep in landfills such as this. You can see that as they throw the garbage in here, they cover it with soil. And by burying this under the soil, you're depriving this decomposable material of oxygen, you're depriving it of light, and therefore very little of it decomposes. Recently they exhumed, that is, they dug up an old landfill, and they found that that landfill was composed of about 50% paper, primarily things such as newspapers or magazines, phone books, a lot of phone books. And some of those newspapers that dated back to 1955 were still perfectly readable after all of those years. Another 5% of the trash was composed of plastics. Another 5% was composed of disposable diapers. That's another major problem in landfills. And the rest was cans and rags and bottles and some foodstuffs. And in fact, amazingly, some types of discarded foodstuffs, such as bones with some meat left on it, or carrots, radishes, material of that nature, the cellular structure of this material was still intact. So what? So what's the problem? As stuff's buried underground, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, why should we worry about old landfills? Well, there's a couple of reasons. A couple of reasons why we have to come up with some alternatives for landfilling. First, we're simply running out of landfill space. It's estimated that within 5 to 10 years, there simply won't be available space to build new landfills. Second, a lot of these landfills are filled with toxic chemicals. There's been a practice, a rather unscrupulous practice, by garbage haulers, trash haulers, to take construction debris and toxic chemicals and mix this in with household wastes and dump this directly into landfills. It forms at the bottom of the landfills a chemical soup called leachate. This practice, called cocktailing, has created basically a chemical or a toxic time bomb in many of these landfills. The problem is these toxins then can leach into groundwater supplies, into rivers, streams, and eventually perhaps into our drinking water. These toxins include PCBs and pesticides, organic solvents, different types of oil products, other toxic chemicals, and toxic metals as well. There's high levels of mercury in many of these landfills that's accumulated from discarded batteries. We sold over 2 billion batteries in this country last year, all containing mercury, much of this going back into landfills. In other words, we do have toxic time bombs on our hand with these landfills, thousands of them across the country. Remember Love Canal. In fact, the concern for these toxic substances is now so great that any new landfills that are approved must have a plastic liner over the entire bottom, a thick plastic liner, and also have drains to remove this leachate. Also, they have to be covered by a 3-inch barrier of clay. Many of the newer ones are taking advantage of the fact that the garbage well below the surface is anaerobic. As we mentioned before, no oxygen getting to it. And the gas that's produced by anaerobic decomposition, methane, can actually be piped out and trapped out of these landfills and used as an alternative source of fuel. This is being done fairly commonly in Europe, and there's a few places in this country that are also starting to get involved in trapping the methane and using it as fuel. What's the answer to the problem? Well, another alternative is incineration, but that's really not a very good answer. Most incinerators are not efficient, enough to completely burn all of the material so that a lot of toxic chemicals are liberated up into the atmosphere. And remember, as we talked about before, these toxins that go into the atmosphere can be recycled back down in precipitation, rainfall, which we're getting a few spurts of right now, as a matter of fact, back into the soil, back into the water, back into our water supplies. And of course, even if you do incinerate and don't release a lot of toxic substances into the atmosphere, you still have the problem with ash. What are you going to do with all of the ash that accumulates? That also will probably contain toxins, and about the only thing you can do with it is landfill it, so we're back where we started. Ultimately, recycling has to be the way that this country, and in fact this world, has to go. Because recycling is the only answer to preventing extreme degradation, toxic degradation of the environment. They estimate we will be recycling about 50% of all of our solid wastes. This works fine. Remember, we said 70% of it is biodegradable. This works fine except for plastics. Plastics remain our #1 problem because they don't biodegrade. Don't be misled by claims you've heard about biodegradable plastics, photo or otherwise. Point in fact is, the way they're handled and buried in landfills, they do not biodegrade. But they can be recycled. Technology is constantly coming up with new ideas, new approaches to recycling all of these plastic wastes. You can't burn them because plastics liberate dioxins and PCBs into the environment. What's the ultimate solution? Well, it certainly isn't shipping garbage to other parts of the globe. I think one of the more frightening things that I read recently is that the United States exports up to 160 million tons, 160,000 tons. I don't want to make it any worse than it is. It's bad enough. 160,000 tons of toxic waste to third world countries. How's that for global responsibility and international ethics? The answer ultimately is to recycle, to compost, and probably what we should do in the future, as much as possible, is to phase out the manufacture of plastics. We manufactured 58 billion pounds of it in 1988. We got along with plastics years ago, got along without plastics, I should say, years ago. We can get along without them in the future as well.